Okay, so I'm trained as a psycholinguist, and I'm interested in understanding how the mental lexicon, which is the part of long-term memory that stores all the words and concepts that we know, how all of that information is organized and how that information affects the way that we process and learn words. So today's talk, I will focus on my work in this area of psycholinguistics and show how they can address these three questions. So in the first part of the talk, I'll talk about how we can represent the mental lexicon as a language network. So that's the part about maybe structure. And then part two, we'll ask the question about how the structure of the lexicon influences processing. And then in the third part, we'll talk about how the structure of the lexicon changes over time. And so that's the question about development of the lexicon. And then finally, I will close the whole talk with just some thoughts, some ideas about theoretical implications of this work. Okay, so in this, oh, sorry, the slide didn't move. Okay, so so words are a very important part to the field of psycholinguistics, so the part of the psychology that focuses on language processing. And words are very complex and multi-dimensional, and I personally find words very interesting for two reasons. I think words are interesting because they have interesting like personalities, so they have interesting word properties. Like, you know, the valence of a word is sort of how positive or negative the a word sort of elicits those feelings in you. A word can have, you know, different frequency, appear at different, you know, frequencies in natural language. So these are like the properties or the personalities of words. But words are also interesting because they have interesting friends or they have interesting neighbors. They keep interesting company. And so there are many different types of relationships between words that we can study. So any two words can have any of these following types of relationships. Words can sound similar to each other, so that's phonological similarity. Words can have similar spellings. Words can also be found in the same, you know, co-occur with each other in natural language, if like you looking at corpora of language. And words can be related to each other in terms of their semantic free associations. So what I really want to try and showcase here is this application of network science to study the relationships between words and how we can quantify all of these different relationships in various ways. Okay, so to demonstrate this idea, if we look at the figure, it has the word speech, and what is also listed is the phonological neighbors of the word speech. So the words that sound like speech, such as speak and speed and peach. Okay. Now, if you also want to fill in the phonological neighbors of those neighbors, then you get a slightly more complicated picture, right? And then if you do the neighbors of neighbors of neighbors, and maybe one step more, you get, you know, the whole lexicon, and it's this big ball of you know, words that are connected to each other in all these different in based on phonological similarity. So this is a very simple example, but I think it shows how challenging it is to quantify the relationships between words, especially if you want to model thousands and thousands of words. And I think that's why in psychology, it's very useful to make use of methodology or a set of tools that can help us make sense of all these relationships. Okay, so the set of tools that, there are many different ways, obviously, that you can use to quantify relationships among words, but the set of tools that I use in my work, as you've heard from, I'm sure, many people in this series of talks, is network science. And it's a set of tools that is commonly used to model complex systems, various kinds of complex systems. So this slide here is just to try and show how useful network science is. There is an example of on the top right, a picture of the network of the internet. So nodes are computers, and if computers are able to talk to each other, there's a connection between them. So that's like a network of the internet. You can also use network science to look at social networks. So on the bottom left, this is actually a social network of characters from the Lord of the Rings movie. And if the two characters are found in the same scene, there's a connection placed between them. And so you get this large scale structure of, the whole sort of social landscape of Lord of the Rings. And you can see, I'm getting a little bit excited, but the Gandalf is my favorite character, and he's in the middle. Okay, so I think the point is, networks are actually, I think, conceptually very intuitive. There's a set of nodes, some sort of entity that you're trying to study in more detail, and the connections or the edges or the links, they represent some sort of relationship that you're interested in studying between those entities. And I put the phrase there, general purpose, because you can, as you can see, you can apply networks to a lot of different types of systems, from a social network to an internet network, for example. Okay, so if we come back to psycholinguistics, I put it's just a list, but this is a list of many areas of psycholinguistics and cognitive psychology that really care about the nature of cognitive and lexical representations. So, for example, people are interested in how do people access words from the mental lexicon in word recognition? How do people produce complex, sentences and speech? How do children learn their native language? How do L2 learners learn their L2? So all these, many different topics in psycholinguistics all really care about words, right? So given that, I think cognitive representations are so central and important to all of these areas, it's very important for the field to have ways to quantify the relations among the words. And I think techniques from network science is quite a promising way to do this. So let me just show you an example of a type of language network that we might be able to achieve with network science. This is a network of an orthographic network of English words. So this is based on the similarity of the spellings of words. So the word cat is the middle, and if they are different, if the word cat is different from the other word based on one edit distance of the letter, they put a connection between them because they are orthographically related or similar, and you get sort of like a form similarity network structure. Now, the other type of network is one that's based more on semantics. So this is an example of a network where the words are the nodes here, and the connections are placed between words that are freely associated with each other in a free association task. So these are actually data that come from the small world of words database. So if I give you a word and ask you to produce, the first word that comes to your mind, I can compile all of that information and make a network out of it. And I think before moving on, it's important to, realize that this is not so not frequently thought about in very detailed ways. The idea that the structure among all these different words. The very common metaphor when people think about a mental lexicon is like a list of words, a literal list of words like you would find in a dictionary. But that doesn't presuppose any structure between them, all of these words, right? They just sort of occur in this long list. But when you use network science methods and you try to, um, fill in all these possible relations among words, then you find this quite beautiful structure, I think. And I think there's information there that is potentially important for helping us to understand language processing and language development, for example. Okay, so given that the structure of the mental lexicon is potentially meaningful, right? It has all these small world properties that others have found. I think it naturally leads to the question of whether the structure of the lexicon can influence various processes that operate within it. In my work, I mostly examine this question in the context of spoken and visual word recognition, and with English, the English language. And so today I'll talk more about the paper that is highlighted below, and I will also give the reference in full later on. But the goal of this work here is to examine how the similarity structure of phonology and orthography come together to influence both spoken and visual word recognition. Okay, I like this figure a lot. I think the reason why I like this image a lot is that it shows that words are found in very complex phonological and orthographic similarity spaces. So the blue section represents the phonological neighbors of the word cat, but also the relations between its neighbors, right? So it's not just a list of its neighbors, but the connections within the neighborhood are also represented. So that's quite a striking image. And the green is orthographic neighbors. So based on, instead of sound similarity, it's like spelling similarity. Now, if you look at the images, right, you'll find that some, but not all, of the phonological and orthographic neighbors of the word cat are actually the same words. Okay, so if we put the two together and we color the connections or the edges differently, we see again another quite wonderful picture that shows the complexities that are embedded in the phonological and orthographic neighborhoods of words. So this leads to the question that this paper is trying to address. If you think about the history of psycholinguistics, people looking at visual and spoken word recognition, there's many years of research showing that phonological and orthographic similarity of words affects how people process words. This is true for both the spoken and the written modalities. Now, in such research, the typical approach is to treat orthographic and phonological similarity effects as separate or independent effects to try and control for, right? So they're treated as sort of the nuisance variable that you try to account for, you try to control for, and then you do the opposite. But I think this approach is a possible drawback is that it makes it quite difficult to properly disentangle phonological and orthographic influences in word recognition. And so are we able to make use of ideas, the conceptual framework of network science to try and think about this question in a new way? Can we actually consider both phonological and orthographic similarity structure of words at the same time, simultaneously, and then use that information to look at lexical retrieval in both spoken and written word recognition? So the way that we are doing this is to leverage on the ideas of multiplex. So if some of you have attended yesterday's talk, then you have learned a lot about multiplex structure already from Massimo Stella's talk. So this is basically a multiplex, but instead of between phonology and semantics, this is a case in a multiplex with a phonological and orthographic layers. Okay, so this work is just to emphasize, this is done on English words, and what was done here was to sort of re-represent the network of English words as a phonological layer in this multiplex and the orthographic layer in this multiplex. So the same, you can see in the figure here that the same words are represented in both layers, but the connection, the type of relationship is different depending on the layer, right? So in the phonological layer, it is phonological similarity. In the orthographic layer, it's based on orthographic similarity. Okay, so in this paper, we want to focus on the part of the multiplex where the phonological and orthographic connections are overlapping. And the two figures in the middle tries to demonstrate that in a more visual way. If you look at the top, if you look in the middle and you look at the top, this has the phonological and orthographic neighborhoods of the word pen put together, but colored differently. And if we just extract the part of the multiplex that's overlapping, which is all the parts in orange, the nodes and links in orange, you get the phonographic neighborhood of the word pen. Okay, so just to clarify a little bit, the way that the connections are defined is based on a one edit distance, one edit Lemmenstein distance. So if the two phonological transcriptions of a word are different by one phoneme, we count those two words as being phonologically similar to each other, and we put a connection between them. And the same goes for looking at the spellings of the words. If they are different by one edit distance based on letter similarity, then those two words are orthographically similar and are connected to each other. And so what is special about the orange connections is that it's both one letter and one phoneme edit distance different from the other word. Okay, so phonographic similarity. It's just my combination of phonological and orthographic similarity. So this is what we want to focus on, and we want to see if this phonographic structure is doing something, anything in word recognition. And the way we did this was to use two network science measures to quantify the similarity structure of individual words in this network. And so we have degree and clustering coefficient. So let's go through each of them in turn. So phonographic degree is the first measure, and this is very simple. It simply counts the number of phonographic neighbors that a word has, or is the number of immediate connections a node has in the phonographic network. Another way of thinking about degree is that it is the size of the neighborhood. So this is on the screens, just a very simple example of a word with low phonographic degree and a word with high phonographic degree. Okay, so the second measure that we looked at is clustering coefficient. So if you consider these two words here, you realize they actually have the same number of phonographic neighbors. But even though they have the same degree, the internal connectivity of those two words actually is very different. So if you fill in these phonographic connections between the words' neighbors, you see that there is structure in these neighborhoods, and some neighborhoods are more or less clustered than others. And this is quantified using a network science measure known as clustering coefficient, which computes the extent to which a node's neighbors are also neighbors of each other. So a very, I think, easy way to think about clustering coefficient is to think of you and think of all of your friends and think about whether your friends are also friends of each other, right? If all of your friends are also friends with each other, they hang out, they talk to each other, you all hang out together, you likely have a high C social, neighborhood, as opposed to if you have a lot of friends, but your friends are sort of not so much interacting with each other, then you have a low C. Okay. So this is just sort of my intuitive way of thinking about what C is representing. It's like the amount of interconnectivity inside a local neighborhood. So I think something that is important to note is that something like clustering coefficient is not something that you can observe if you don't use network analysis in the first place to try and quantify these relationships among words. You might be able to get degree through a different way. Maybe you by just sort of looking at list of phonological and orthographic neighbors and trying to count how many are overlapping, that would give you degree. But if you don't consider all of the connections between all of the words, then you miss out internal information, which is, I think, what clustering coefficient is capturing here. So this leads to the specific question, which is whether phonographic degree and clustering coefficient affects word recognition in both the spoken and visual modalities. And to do this, we use two psycholinguistic tasks that are very commonly used to study lexical processing, single word recognition. So the first one is a naming task, and the second one is lexical decision. So just very quickly, in a naming task, you are in a visual modality, you are shown the single word on the screen, and your job is to pronounce the word as quickly as you can, and we would measure the reaction time it takes you from seeing the word to making the production. If it's in the auditory modality, you are presented with the single word over headphones, and then you're asked to repeat the word that you heard. And again, we measure the reaction time it takes for you to do this, and we also record any incorrect productions or pronunciations, right, as accuracy. In lexical decision, you're presented with words and non-words. So non-words are like made up, they don't represent any real words in that given language. And that can be done again in a visual modality and also in the auditory modality. And the reason why is that we use these two tasks is because they are commonly used, and that their implementation is actually very similar in both the visual and the spoken modalities. So in lexical decision, your job is just to decide whether you heard a real word or not a real word by pressing buttons. And we would measure the same things, errors or accuracy and reaction time. Okay, so something that is very, I think, crucial to note is that in word recognition, it is frequently known that words have a lot of other properties that also are known to affect the speed and the accuracy of word recognition. For example, word frequency is a very important predictor of naming and lexical decision reaction times, and along with a bunch of other variables. So it's very important for us that we make sure that we try and take into account these influences, because we know that they have such a big effect. So what we did was that we have a long list of covariates that we then included into our mixed effects models or regression models. And something that we also included that's also in blue are the single layer similarity measures. So remember that the phonographic degree in C is the overlap of the two networks. What we wanted to also do was to see if phonographic degree is accounting for more variability than the additive effects of just phonological degree in C and just orthographic degree in C. So I think this represents a very conservative, very rigorous test of whether phonographic similarity is doing anything in lexical decision and in naming. Okay, so this slide just goes through the method and the data that we use. In spoken word recognition, we did lab experiments in a lab. We chose 160 words that had different values of phonographic degree and C, and analyzed the data with mixed effects models, along with including the list of covariates that I mentioned just now. Now, in visual word recognition, one very nice thing is that I don't need to collect my own data because the data already exists. This is part of this trend in psycholinguistics where people are collecting huge amounts of behavioral data and presenting them as a mega study database that you can download and reanalyze their data. So someone has already done naming and lexical decision for over 2,000 words that we had in our phonographic network. So we basically used their data and did some archival reanalysis of that data. So we can just go straight into the results, right? So this is a summary of the results from the spoken word recognition study. I am presenting here the marginal effects of phonographic degree and phonographic C on the top and on the bottom, the reaction times for naming on the left and lexical decision on the right. So the y-axis is reaction time, and then the x-axis is the network measure. So what you can, so because there are marginal effects, that means we have already taken into account the influence of all these other covariates like frequency and the single layer network measures. Okay, so what we are actually finding here is that phonographic C is a significant predictor of naming and lexical decision in the auditory modality. Degree was not significant, but it was, had the trend of it facilitating the performance. So you're faster, people were faster at responding to words with high phonographic C in lexical decision, faster also to name them. For accuracy, the results are not presented here, but performance was basically at ceiling, so we didn't find any effects for accuracy. These are very simple tasks, so I guess that was expected. This slide shows a summary of the results from the analysis of the megastudy data. So, so this is for visual word recognition. And again, I'm showing the marginal effects of phonographic degree and phonographic C, top and the bottom, and then the same thing, naming is on the left, lexical decision is on the right. Now here we don't find any significant effects of phonographic C, but we do find that phonographic degree was a significant predictor of naming and lexical decision. And we also found the same for accuracy. So having more phonographic neighbors facilitates visual word recognition. Okay, so the summary. Overall, there is a facilitatory effect of phonographic degree on visual word recognition. So words with more phonographic neighbors, words that are both phonologically and orthographically similar, will more quickly recognized. And we also found a facilitatory effect of phonographic clustering coefficient. So this is on spoken word recognition, and words with a greater amount of interconnectivity among its phonographic neighbors will more quickly recognized or responded to. So the question here is why? We suggest that the facilitatory effects of phonographic similarity arise because of the overlap in the phonological and orthographic similarity structure. And what this overlap is representing is that it allows for activation in both layers of the multiplex to converge in ways that would boost activation and boost lexical access. I think one way to think about what this overlap is doing, I think the overlap is important to realize that is that it formalizes, right? Sorry, let me start again. So I think what the phonographic network is very important, theoretically important for, is that it provides a formalization of this overlap in phonology and orthography, which was historically treated as two separate things to control for, right? And I think it provides this very nice, explicit, explanation, structural explanation for why we see facilitatory effects of phonographic degree. It provides a way of quantifying how activation patterns from different layers might converge, how different pieces of information about words can be combined to facilitate lexical retrieval. And I think something that's important to note is that we find these effects of phonographic similarity even after controlling for phonological only and orthographic only similarity measures. So phonographic similarity, the overlapping parts, is doing more than just simply combining two pieces of information separately or additively. Okay, so yes, I think for so that was what we found in that paper. What I wanted to point out in this slide is that we were actually able to replicate the patterns for the visual word recognition with new megastudy data. So the AELP stands for Auditory English Lexicon Project. And this is a megastudy, but for spoken word recognition and for auditory lexical decision. And it's a very recent megastudy that came out this year by colleagues in my university. So that's very, very helpful. And so what I did was to basically take that data and reanalyzed it to see if phonographic degree and phonographic C did facilitate spoken word recognition with a much larger set of words. So this is like a few thousand words now. And what you can see here is, again, phonographic degree and phonographic C, they both facilitate auditory lexical decision performance. So you're faster for words with many neighbors, many phonographic neighbors, and also faster if those neighbors are all neighbors of each other. So I think it's very nice to be able to replicate the findings with a completely independent set of data, and gives us more confidence that this is a result that does stand. Okay, so let me move on. I wanted to conclude very quickly. Before concluding, just very quickly mentioning some current and ongoing work related to phonographic similarity. So the first paper is sort of a additional project that I did, which looked at the phonological and orthographic networks of languages other than English. I think something that psycholinguistics can do better is to sort of reduce this overemphasis on studying English. I think there are like 5,000 or 6,000 other languages in the world, and they're also worth studying. So where I was able to get data for French, Dutch, and Spanish, and they also had the relevant mega study. Basically, I found that, again, the structure of the words in all these other languages also affects visual lexical decision. So that sort of shows that this is not just limited to English. And then the second paper was very recently published, but this was work done in collaboration with Korean professors from Korea, from South Korea, and we managed to make like an orthographic network based on like the Korean Hangul script, and then we found that network structure does influence how quickly visual lexical decision is done with Korean Hangul words. So that's pretty neat. I think there's a lot of rich sort of potential for this approach, but let me just stop here and do a very quick conclusion so that we can move on to the next part of the talk. Okay, so this is the concluding slide, and just to sort of emphasize that the question was about whether phonographic similarity influence visual and spoken word recognition, and it's important for it to do so after accounting for phonological only and orthographic only information similarity measures. And this is indeed what we found. And so let's move on to the next part. Okay, so given that we saw from just now, right, the structure of the lexicon affects how words are recognized. This part of the talk focuses on the question of how the structure of the lexicon came to be in the first place. And this is a question that is especially important in the context of language development and cognitive decline. And so here I will present some recent work showing how we can quantify structural change in the phonological network over time. And I like to begin with this figure, which is from Dubrovsky et al., showing the associative structure of the lexicon, how it changes over the lifespan from a young, I think it's from 10 years, and then to a young adult, middle age, and then old age. And I think this figure is very nice because it shows how the structure of the lexicon is not static. There is clearly dynamic change that is happening over the lifespan. Obviously, the lexicon is able to take into account new concepts that a person learns over time, as well as the new associations between those concepts that are being acquired and learned and retained in the mental lexicon. And I think network growth models from network science can be very useful in studying structural change in the phonological network as it grows over time. Okay, so before I begin sort of getting into the details of these two models, I do want to say that there is a long and rich literature and history of body of work looking at language acquisition, vocabulary development, word learning, and a lot of it tends to focus on more like local structural relations, how that affects word learning. And I think what the application of networks does is that it forces you to think of the lexicon as in its entirety, and think about how the large scale structure of the whole lexicon affects learning. So it's answering the same question, but with a completely different type of framework and overview. So what I will do here is to focus on describing the two network models that we looked at in this paper. The first one is preferential attachment, which is quite familiar to people who already do research on network science or in complex systems. And the other one is preferential attachment on the right. And this is introduced by Thomas Hills in a very prominent psychological science 2009 paper, looking basically at the network growth of semantic networks. And I think it's important to maybe just go through them in a bit more detail, because then it's good to be very explicit about what each of these models are saying. Okay, so if you look at preferential, well, if you look at both of these figures, right, the gray circles, the smaller gray circles, are the words that the learner already knows. So they are put in a gray-like circle. It represents the lexicon that is already in the learner's mind. And the bigger nodes in white and in red, these are the words that are not yet learned, right, by the kid, by the learner. And the connections are placed between the words, and these connections can be either semantic or phonological relations, depending on what is your specific research question. So in both of these figures, actually the underlying network structure, so if you compare the connections, it's actually identical, but the models make a different prediction about which word the learner is most likely to learn next. Now in preferential attachment, which is the one on the left, the prediction is that the word that connects to a known word that has many connections will be acquired. So is this rich gets richer idea, right? A node that already has many neighbors tends to get more neighbors, right? Tends to get richer. And so the general idea here is that it is the structure that's inside the mental lexicon that drives what you learn next. Now, in preferential acquisition, which is the one on the right, the prediction is that the word that has the most connections in the broader learning environment that the learner is currently being exposed to, that is the word that is most likely to be learned. So the words that are landmarks or they are central words in this landscape of words that you're exposed to, that's what you're likely to learn next. And so for preferential acquisition, the key idea here is that it is structure in the learning environment that drives learning. Now, as I mentioned previously, the connections can be any kind of relationship that you're interested in modeling. Now, previous work has shown that when the connections are semantic or feature-based, preferential acquisition is the algorithm that best accounted for empirical data, with empirical data sort of with the learning trajectories of various words among children. So if the connections that in the two figures are semantically based or feature-based, preferential acquisition is the better model for network growth. So what we wanted to look at in this paper was to ask, what if those connections are based on phonological similarity instead? So whether two words sound like each other. Would it be preferential attachment or preferential acquisition that might do better? Right? So that's our research question for this particular paper. Okay, so in this study, we use age of acquisition data from a large set of English and Dutch words. So age of acquisition ratings are self-report data. I provide the word to the speaker of that language and ask them to tell me at what age they think they learn this word. So it's important to bear in mind this is a self-report measure. But the reason why we use age of acquisition norms is that gave us access to thousands of words, and we could look at development on this longer time scale instead of being limited to the first 2 or 3 or 4 years of life or thereabouts, or maybe a bit more. It allows us to sort of look at more long-term development of the normative individual who is learning English or is learning Dutch. And then we basically created phonological networks of words at different time points and used this information to make predictions about which words were more likely to be learned at the next time point, and use a simple logistic regression model to assess how good each growth model's predictions were. And in all of these logistic regressions, we included length and frequency as covariates because they are known to affect word acquisition. So this slide, I'm trying to provide a bit more of a visual overview of the analysis pipeline. So again, we split the age of acquisition data set into different years, make a phonological network based on words that are known at a given time point. So that's the known words network below. And we also sort of created like a network of that represented the learning environment that the learner was presumably exposed to. And so this includes the words that are not yet acquired at that time point. And using the known words and the learning environment networks, we can produce growth values, which are basically the prediction of whether a word is likely to be learned in the next time step. So these are growth values basically represent the model prediction. And the data is basically represented in this way. We have a final column that says whether the word was acquired or not in the next time step. And we wanted to see how each of the preferential attachment or preferential acquisition, how well they did in doing sort of prediction of which word was going to be learned next. Okay. Oops. Okay, so here are the results. So, okay, so first of all, preferential acquisition was not a significant predictor of learning. So they're not shown here. Um, um, what I'm showing here is the figures is the effect of preferential attachment. Okay, so what we have on the graph here is the graph on the left is for the English norms, and then the graph on the right is for the Dutch norms. And I think it's quite striking that we find similar patterns in two different languages. The y-axis is a predicted probability from the logistic model, and then on the x-axis, that is the model prediction or the preferential attachment growth value. Um, and what we have are three lines with different colors. The red line representing the effect of preferential attachment on an early network, and then the green line representing a more mature network. And what you can already see is that there's a significant interaction between preferential attachment and the age of the network. So the nature of the interaction is such that in the early years, there's a tendency to learn words that sound similar to words with many phonological neighbors. So this is the standard preferential attachment growth model. And what happens is that at around 6 or 7 years, this effect flips, and now there's an effect of inverse preferential attachment, such that you are actually more likely to learn words that are phonologically distinctive. They sound different from the words that you already know. And I think, you know, it's quite interesting to note that this 6 or 7 years, it does coincide with a lot of the work that Massimo Stanley sort of presented at the point at which the least, you know, viable cluster sort of emerges in the multiplex. So I think there's a lot of, you know, things pointing to different sort of evidence pointing to a very similar pattern, which is, I think, is quite fascinating. So I guess the broad takeaway here is that when your connections are phonological similarity, it seems as if the structure in the lexicon is what is driving learning. What you already know drives what you're likely to learn next based on this, and that's sort of represented by the preferential attachment and inverse preferential attachment model. On the other hand, when you are, you know, when the learning semantic representations, so what was done previously by Thomas Hills and others, then structure in the learning environment is what seems to drive learning in that case. Okay, so I'll try and speed up because I believe I'm running a bit slow, but okay, so let's see, word learning experiment, yes. So we did this, you know, longitudinal network analysis, okay, and it's quite interesting. We seem to see that when the lexicon is a mature lexicon, you actually get some sort of opposite version of preferential attachment, which is so prominent in network science. So when your lexicon is mature, new words that connect to known words with few neighbors are more readily acquired than the opposite. And we really wanted to test this hypothesis empirically. And so we conducted a word learning experiment with college-age participants that we presume have a mature lexicon. So what we did was to create a set of non-word stimuli and make sure that they either had high or low growth values for preferential attachment. So remember, growth values is just our prediction based on the network model for, you know, a normative participant based on like 20,000 words. And so based on this sort of normative network, we computed these values for the non-words that we constructed. So the non-words that we have were, I believe they are monosyllabic non-words, and they are contain phonological sequences that are legal in English. Okay, so they are basically like viable words in English. And we use a word learning paradigm very commonly used in the literature, and that's to pair the non-word with a non-object and to see if the participants able to then correctly name the non-object that was connected to the non-word. So here is an example of a non-object. They are not real objects, so they are basically features taken from real objects and spliced together. And the reason for doing that is so that this object doesn't have a real world label attached to it. And then we would randomly assign these non-objects to the non-words and presented them together to the participant. And then we would measure their ability to learn these new words by doing a picture naming task where we would present the non-object and ask the participant to try and produce the name of this non-object. Okay. So this slide, the graph here just shows a proportion of correctly named picture naming trials. So there were three learning and testing blocks, and the low preferential attachment non-words are in orange, and the high preferential attachment non-words is in gray. So what you can clearly see is that the words with the low preferential attachment growth values were more accurately produced in the picture naming in the final block. We did a logistic regression as well, including a lot of covariates, phonotactic probability, duration of the sound file, properties of the non-words to account for all these things. And yes, we do find that non-words with the lower preferential attachment values had a higher odds of being correctly produced in picture naming. So overall, this is consistent with our initial prediction, sort of an inverse preferential attachment bias perhaps affecting learning in mature networks. So now finally, we also wanted to explore this mechanism of inverse preferential attachment with some computational simulations. So in these simulations, we allow an artificial network to grow via each of these conditions. So by the standard preferential attachment, so the new node coming in is more likely to attach to a node with high degree. Inverse preferential attachment is sort of the opposite. If a new node is coming in, it tends to connect to the node with few connections. And then it's random attachment, and then they were hybrid versions of inverse and standard preferential attachment. And what we also looked at was to manipulate the time of switch. So it's an whether the model, the growth model switch early or late, and that's, you can sort of see that in the figure here. Okay, so something to note, okay, is that these simulations are not intended to simulate actual word learning in actual language networks. These are artificial, simple networks and quite sparse in the types of networks. And the goal here is just to establish a simple proof of concept of what inverse preferential attachment is doing and what it might lead to. So what I also want to point out is if you can see this orange box around the standard preferential attachment inverse 200, 800. This is the condition that we wanted to really pay attention to, because this is what the previous two studies are suggesting, that early in the development of a phonological lexicon, that's driven by preferential attachment, the standard version, and then at like 6 years, it switches to inverse preferential attachment. So a relatively early switch in the lifespan of an individual. And so we wanted to see how this particular type of network might look like with these simulations. Okay, so what we did was to compare the overall network structure of the networks produced by these different conditions. And what you see on the left side of the screen, that is a graph for L is average shortest path length, and the so if you, and then the right is a diameter. Yes, the network diameter of the network. And on the y-axis, sorry, on the x-axis, that is the time of the switch, and the blue is for the networks that were grown by inverse preferential attachment first, then switch to standard, and then the red is starting with standard preferential attachment, then switching to inverse. Okay, so across the board, networks that were grown by preferential attachment first, regardless of the time of switch, had shorter average path lengths and lower network diameters than networks that were grown by inverse preferential first. And why are these two network measures potentially important? Because they might suggest processing efficiencies in the network. Easy to navigate if you have a network that has relatively low diameter, which is like the longest short path between nodes in that network. And on the right, this is a simple visual depiction of the networks grown by different types of approaches. So pure preferential attachment is on the left, then pure inverse is in the middle, and then the hybrid is on the rightmost part of the screen. Obviously, with preferential attachment, you already see the emergence of hubs, which are nodes with a lot of connections. These like super high degree nodes already sort of emerging very early on. This is only with 100 nodes. And what you find in the hybrid version is that it has a bit of both, right? It's not so dominated by hubs, but it also seems to be a lot more compact type of structure as compared to the pure inverse preferential attachment network. What we also did was to analyze the degree distribution of these networks, which is the distribution of nodes with a certain number of connections or a certain number of neighbors. Okay, and there is a lot more detail about the exact analysis pipeline, which you can read in the entropy paper. It's quite a lot because we tried to follow the recommendations of Closet et al. And just followed their workflow as closely as possible and tried to be very statistically vigorous. And so the main finding is highlighted in the slide here, and the figure is showing on the y-axis p-values of two-sided Wung's tests. What a Wung's test is doing is comparing the power law and exponential distribution fits to the observed degree distribution of the simulated network. And a low p-value in this comparison says that you can prefer the power law distribution over the alternate distribution. But a high p-value says you cannot really exclusively classify it as one or the other. You cannot prefer one distribution or another. It's more ambiguous. So that's the general interpretation of these p-values. Okay, so if you focus on the part that's in the orange box. So again, this is the preferential attachment first with a quick early switch to inverse. That particular network has p-values that are not below the threshold of 0.05. And what this suggests is that this type of network has degree distributions that cannot exclusively be classified as a power law when contrasted with an exponential distribution. And qualitatively, this seems to resemble degree distributions of real-world phonological networks. So in this little graph here, this is the degree distributions plotted on a log-log scale for English and Spanish phonological networks. And you can see it's not just a clean power law distribution. Yeah, so I think it's, even though these are more like a qualitative observation, I think what this suggests is that the orange network is kind of interesting, right? It has a degree distribution that isn't quite like a power law. At least you cannot confidently say that it's a power law. But it still has a relatively low network diameter, relatively low shortest path length, which are all properties that are good for navigation and efficient, navigation efficiency within the network. And so if you take the complete, you take all of this stuff together, the computational experiments, I think they provide converging support for the archival, the longitudinal network analysis with the age of acquisition norms and the word learning experiments. And they suggest that the phonological lexicon, its development can be accounted for by, a type of growth algorithm that might start off first as like a preferential attachment, and then switching early on such that you prefer phonologically distinctive word forms. It's like an inverse preferential attachment. Oh, I guess I already mentioned this. Yeah, but I guess the point, I guess the broader point here is that there is a lot of potential in using network science methods to study growth of the network, or long-term changes in a network structure of words. And hopefully the collection of studies here showcase how you can use a lot of different types of methods to get at a particular question. You can do these numerical, type of simulations with artificial networks. You can, analyze pre-existing behavioral data with a network science sort of framework. Or you can also, use do a bunch of empirical studies, right, to assess some of these predictions that come out from, other, yeah, other analyses, for example. So even though, all these approaches look very different from each other, I think they all come together quite nicely to showcase how early acquisition is, I think, driven by this very sort of rapid filling out of phonological spaces, right? A word that has many phonological names already tends to gain all these other words that sound like it. And once that space is filled out, which happens quite quickly, then the acquisition is driven by a preference for something that is distinctive, for at least phonologically. Okay, so so here's a summary of everything so far. We can represent the mental lexicon as a network, yes, and what that does is that it gives us new ways of looking at its structure. Now, when we have this information, we can ask two further questions. The first question is asking how the structure affects processing. And I provided an example of how we can do this from looking at a phonographic similarity network and showing that that structure does affect the processing of both spoken and visual words. And then the second question is about how the structure changes over time. And actually, there's a lot of work, as you can use. You may have noticed from the talks that you've listened to. Already, a lot of work looking at development of the mental lexicon, and this is my contribution is a very small one in that space, is to and really focusing on what's the role of these phonological relations. I think even though this area of psycholinguistics, language acquisition, is very driven by semantic relations and associations and co-occurrences and so on. I think you can't have semantics unless you think about form, right? So if an infant is not able to segment, phonological forms, it can't sort of detect words, then the next step of mapping the form to meaning doesn't quite happen. So all these information needs to come together. I think the multiplex networks approach that Massimo Stella sort of is putting forward is very, very exciting in this regard. Okay, so I have maybe 10 minutes to go to try and maybe provide a more broader theoretical sort of overview of this work and how it situates more broadly in psychology. And so I want to end today's lecture by going back to the past in an ironic way. So a lot of the information that I talk about in this part, you can read it in a recent commentary I published with Nicole Castro, and I'll put the reference later. So I think I want to emphasize, right, that historically, psychologists have always had a long-standing interest in representing cognitive structures like memory and knowledge. And in fact, many important models in psycholinguistics, in psychology, in cognitive science are networks in disguise, even if they don't explicitly, say so, or they might say that they're networks and then people forget about them, and and so on. So here are just very briefly like 3 examples, right? Collins and Loftus is very put forward, I think, a quite influential model of semantic memory as a connection of concepts that are connected to each other, and introduce this spreading activation mechanism that can spread on this network structure in order to account for sentence verification, empirical results that they're finding in sentence verification. And this is, building on the work of Quillian, who sort of, started, is known as the TLC. I can't remember the exact thing, but that was his model. And it was very ambitious at that time to try and represent semantics in this sort of form. And the second example is work by Gary Dell and colleagues, and they were looking at, they were building a model and have built a model that combines a conceptual layer and a phonological layer to try and simulate the types of errors, the pattern of errors that people with aphasia make when they are trying to produce the names of the pictures, like in the picture naming task. So even though it's a small network, I think like you can see what's very interesting of their model is that they are combining different information from semantics and phonology, trying to think about how patterns of activation spreading in this sort of network representation can account for aphasic performance on picture naming. And then finally, there are many, this is just one example of the many connectionist models that have been developed for explaining all kinds of language processing. This is just an example, the Seidenberg and Plaut model trying to account for word naming. I think it's quite a cute model. I think it has like a few hundred sort of nodes and with a single hidden layer. But I think the point of these going through these just very quickly. And so I think these examples demonstrate that networks are useful for psychology, as long as there are relationships among entities that you are studying. They can be represented as a network. And it's not that we believe that networks are a true representation of memory structure, right? But the benefit of doing that is that we can capitalize on the methods from graph theory and have much stronger, better quantitative ways of measuring and understanding cognitive structure. So early psychologists they saw the potential of graph theory and networks, but they were also skeptical, and that explains why for example, the Collins and Loftus model was sort of forgotten for a little bit. And my hypothesis for why people are so skeptical even today probably stems from the what they see as this innate incompatibility of a mathematical approach from graph theory and now modern network science. They think that is not compatible with the goal of cognitive science, which is to explain human behavior. And to demonstrate how skeptical people were, here are some examples from 70s and 80s. And these are cognitive psychologists. essentially saying that it is not enough to represent um, um, cognition or semantic memory of the mental lexicon as uh, as a network, right? We need to be able to explain how that structure is used in various cognitive processes, and we also need to explain the emergence of that structure through human experience. So the Johnson-led paper is quite a nice one, and it's arguing actually against, I think, all these semantic network models and semantic feature models and things like that, and basically, pushing forward the notion, which is very true, that the meaning of words is not sort of a thing that stands on its own. Words are very ambiguous in its meaning, and probably you need to make use of contextual information to figure out what a word means. And what that means is that you cannot just build a network and assume that that works as for any person to derive meaning from it. There needs to be an additional process, something that operates on the semantic network that can help us understand semantic processing that is contextually driven. So, and then the other, the Greeno and the Estes one also saying very similar ideas and critiques, saying that we really need to think about process. We really want to know how people solve problems. We want to know how hierarchical memory structures emerge. So what's, I think, fairly interesting is that all of these critiques align with broader changes that are happening in psychology, especially American psychology. So behaviorist sort of frameworks giving way to cognitive psychology, where people are moving from looking at explicit behavior to trying to study internal mechanisms of what might lead to that behavior. So, in response to these critiques, I think for people who are keen to use networks to study various topics in psychology, I think we really have to think carefully about this question. I think it's a valid thing to consider. How can modern network science rise to this theoretical challenge? It's not enough to just represent the network and do, quantify in very fancy ways. We really want to think about what are the processes that occur on the network, and we also want to think about the emergence or the development or the decline of the network structure over the long term. So I go into more detail in the paper, but I suggest that it may be helpful to think about real-time processes as occurring on a shorter time scale on a more stable network representation, and then contrast that to longer changes that occur to the network itself. And so if you look on the left side, if you are, sort of focusing on processes that are a bit more bottom up, more driven by the perceptual input, it may be like word recognition. It may be that you don't need a very complicated process model implemented on a network. That could be done with a simple random walker, for example. On the other hand, if you are interested in more complex type of processes, maybe problem solving, fluency, that type of cognitive processes that are more driven by top-down control or goal-directed type of behavior, maybe a slightly more complicated process model needs to be implemented on the cognitive structure, on the cognitive network, like a biased random walker that can maybe adapt flexibly to the goal in mind. Now, when thinking about changes to the network itself, right, so we are now sort of saying that the structure of the network can change. It can get bigger, it can get smaller, it can change its connections. There are many examples of people doing great work on this exact topic. And a lot of researchers are leveraging on generative network growth models like preferential attachment, or I think this work from Bassett's lab that using sort of mathematical techniques to look to detect gaps in a network and when the gap is filled in. And so there are all these very a lot of potential, right, to be applied to questions of psychology. And so I think all of these approaches have been very useful in studying how the structure of the lexicon, all knowledge, the structure of knowledge, how that changes over the long term. But I also think it's worth highlighting that it's possible to perhaps model more sudden changes in the lexicon. So that might arise perhaps through the process of problem solving, through creative insight, where shortcuts are discovered in the mental lexicon that sort of changes the overall structure in a very big way. So I think what I'm trying to maybe conclude with is a bit more of a philosophical type of thinking about how networks are used in psychology and how we can optimize that. So by no means, any of these things are, I, you know, I want to sort of also mention that we don't need to consider the real-time processes and the long-term development as categorical concepts. They all could influence and inform each other. So I think what I want to sum up for this section is that I think it's useful for modern psychology researchers to think about this question as you are thinking of applying network science to your research question. That you can already see from the critiques, right, of the psychologists in the past, that the networks on its own don't do anything, right? It doesn't do anything or doesn't sort of say anything specifically to questions that psychologists are interested in, related to language processing, related to learning, and so on and so forth. And so I think, think about this question as sort of making sure that the network science application can add to the existing literature in psychology and still address the core questions in important way, but yet advance the whole field in new ways. I think this is something to consider going forward. So hopefully this is just more like food for thought for everyone to think about. And you can read more about this topic in the paper. So this is the Oh, okay. So I guess this is just this is the end of my talk. Hopefully you can see how the previous section where I talked about the mental lexicon as a network, phonographic structure, and the phonological lexicon growing and changing over time, how all of these things really, all fit together, I think. And an example of how network science can be used to study processes on the network and development of the network. So with that, so I put in here some key references. These are the papers that I talked about in most detail today. You can look at them if you're interested in any of them. And that's the end of my talk. And I think I'm ready for any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Olga?
Yeah, thank you very much for very nice presentation and your introduction to theory. It was really very useful, I think, for all of us. And okay, can I start from my questions? Because I have two. My first question concerning the part of word recognition. And I would like to ask, so you studied correlation between word recognition and different properties, so like degree and clustering coefficients, right? But did you see how another properties can affect on words recognition? Say, for example, centrality, different centrality measure. So it seems like if, for example, a word has a high centrality, it may be easy to recognize it. What do you think about that?
Yes, so there are many centrality measures in networks.
Yeah.
I only use in this one I use degree centrality, right, and then local clustering. I have found in other work that closeness centrality also helps. So it's the centrality, yes, the number of yes, the shortest path between the node and all other nodes in the network, right? That's closest centrality. We also found evidence for that with spoken word recognition. I believe this is a Goldstein and Vitovich paper that they found. I can't remember the year exactly, but it's in a Frontiers of Psychology paper. So they found evidence for that. I also found evidence for closer centrality. I think in the Korean Hangul network, closer centrality was actually quite good as a predictor. And so I think the question, maybe bigger question, is that there are many centrality measures that you can get from networks. So how do you know which is worth to, which are important ones to to try and to look at? Because if you put everything into the model, then everything might be significant and I think this is an open question. I think a lot of the centrality measures from the networks tend to be quite highly correlated with each other. And so it may be worthwhile to take a big data approach and to compete each centrality measure based on which one is doing the most, covering the most amount of variability. And maybe that might be a useful measure, but I think I may be over. Yeah, hopefully this is okay. Do you have a further question related to that?
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So actually, yeah, it was just my interest, and I have another question about your model of. So it's a really beautiful model of preferential attachment and inverse preferential. Okay, like two different mechanisms. Yes. Right? And my question is, you compared degree distribution of your model and experimental data, right? But did you compare other properties like clustering coefficient or maybe I don't know, component size or shortest path, so on?
Yes, I did compare shortest path and diameter. Yes, I think clustering is not, was not even, with the real networks, I mean. Okay. I did not, because the artificial networks were very different from the real networks in terms of size and in terms of the structure. So the degree distribution comparison with the real networks is more of a qualitative type of assessment. I think going forward, I would like to properly simulate actual growth of language networks, and I think then we can do a more specific comparison. The inverse preferential computational experiments were done on the very small toy networks, not trying to replicate any real type of language development. So there's a limitation there. So maybe it's not so good to compare now. But then when we try to model something more realistic, then yeah, we can start to do all these nice suggestions that you have.
I see. Thank you very much. And we have another question from Nana question. Could we read this question or
is it in the chat?
In the chat, yes, right. About Japanese language.
Oh, Japanese language.
Yeah. Can we apply network analysis to Japanese language?
I guess I haven't done it, but I don't see why not. If the person has expertise in the language, then I'm very happy to get in touch and to make a collaboration, because especially with languages that I'm not familiar with, I don't want to go and try and model it without any expert input. So especially with the Korean paper, I work very closely with a professor from Korea to try and understand how is Korean structured and how we can potentially apply the networks to model the similarity relations. And so we basically decompose the Korean words into their their letters. We had to write a special program to do it, but it can be done. So I think like it's very important to, before we approach modeling any specific language, that we consult with someone who's actually an expert in that language. So I don't know Japanese well enough to make any suggestion or thoughts about how it might be possible, but I don't see why not. Networks are very general purpose type of techniques, so I think it's possible. But if the person is an expert, please, you can write to me.
And
is there another question?
What do you think about Russian language in?
I don't know. I don't know enough about Russian. Is it very morphologically rich and
yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so maybe morphemes. So it may be that morphemes might be a more useful layer to model, right? Not so much the individual letters, perhaps. I mean, I'm thinking of what's another very morphologically rich language. It could be Turkish is pretty morphologically rich, I think. So that's why it depends on the structure of the language. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay. So one question in the chat.
Okay. For some reason, I cannot see the chat, but maybe you can. So sorry,
okay.
you have to read the question.
On slide 22, you have showed the dynamical changes in lexical networks during life. Slide 22.
Okay, let me go.
Okay,
this one.
Yes. Can you tell some practical applications of this research?
Practical implications.
Yeah.
This is a difficult question for me because I do basic research, but let me try. So I think I want to say that for this particular slide, this is based on Dutch speakers, and it is a cross-sectional. So it's not a longitudinal type of network. They sample Dutch speakers of young to old with a free association task. Then they make the network. So you have this structure. That's what the figure represents. I think I can think of maybe a couple implications for looking at the associative dynamic change of the network structure. So one is to, in the early stages, to maybe use it to perhaps detect atypical development in young children. So far, all these networks are based on population level and their group statistics, but I think there's a possibility to start estimating individual persons' networks. Now, when we can get to that, then we can look more specifically at the trajectory of the development that a kid might be showing. Maybe they are learning associations between very random words semantically, perhaps, and the structure looks more random than it should at a given time point. So it can be possibly have some sort of clinical application, early detection of atypical development of mental lexicon. And then in older age with cognitive decline, it's quite common for in older networks to have the more weak associations to be lost. That is quite commonly found in all of these analyses. But if the loss in the weak associations occurs too early in life, that is also an indication of early cognitive decline. That's maybe not so good. So it can serve all these early detection possibilities, I think, by tracking or modeling dynamic network structure of the lexicon over time. But maybe the research now is too far to get to that point, but I think there's potential. So hopefully I can address that question to that person.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for your lecture. Our time is up. That's why we must say
Okay.
goodbye, and I hope we see you soon. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I had a very nice time talking to everyone. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank
I will
you.
send the slides. Okay.